Every once in a while, a book comes along that genuinely gets under my skin. Not because it tries to shock, but because the stories inside it feel grounded, carefully researched, and, well, extremely creepy. One of those books came through my letterbox recently, the best-selling A Cursed Collection of Haunted Dolls by Fiona Dodwell, published by Llewellyn Publications. Fiona's an author whose work I've admired for a long time. She approaches the paranormal with a mix of curiosity, compassion, and proper investigation, and the cases she chooses tend to be the ones that stay with you, the ones that raise questions instead of trying to hand out easy answers. We've been chatting over the past few weeks, and she's kindly given me permission to feature one of the cases she's documented in today's episode. The book is available now from all the usual booksellers if you'd like to explore it further. And there was one doll in particular that stood out the moment I opened the book, Peggy. Not just a curious object, but a case with witnesses, reactions, and physical effects that are unusual even by haunted doll standards. Before we get into Peggy's story though, it's worth taking a moment to look at the wider history of dolls, where these beliefs come from, why these objects attract so much attention, and how they've become one of the most chilling themes in modern day folklore. Dolls have been part of human life for thousands of years. They've been toys, teaching tools, ritual objects, and symbols of status. Some have been made of clay or wood, others of wax, leather, cloth, or bone. But whatever form they take, dolls sit right on the line between the familiar and the frightening. Shaped like people, but not alive. Recognizable, but mute. Present, but passive. That strange balance is why they keep turning up in stories from so many cultures. Long before modern horror films turned dolls into sharp-toothed villains, many cultures treated them with respect, caution, or in some cases, outright fear. In parts of ancient Egypt, small carved figures known as shabti were placed in tombs as companions and helpers for the dead. Some were meant to protect, others were believed to carry out work on behalf of the deceased in the afterlife. Even in these early examples, these objects weren't just toys, they were vessels for meaning and ritual purpose, created to represent intention, service, or spiritual assistance. In ancient Greece and Rome, small wax or clay figurines were sometimes used in rituals connected with luck, fertility, or protection. They weren't toys in the modern sense, but their human-like form made them powerful symbolic tools. In Japan, Hina dolls have long been linked with spiritual belief. During the Hina Matsuri festival, families placed dolls on display to represent good fortune. And in older traditions, some dolls were set afloat down the rivers in a ritual called Hina Nagashi, carrying misfortune or illness away from the household. The practice treats the dolls with a kind of respect, as if they hold more than their material form. In parts of Africa and the Caribbean, human-shaped figures have long been used in spiritual and communal practices. These objects were never viewed as sinister. They served as symbols, links between the living and their ancestors, tools for teaching, or focal points for intention and ritual. Modern media often distorts these traditions into clichés, but historically these figures were treated with respect, stand-ins for a person, expressions of prayer, or representations connected to guidance or memory. And across Europe, particularly in the medieval and early modern periods, small human-shaped figures also carried meaning. Poppets, made of cloth, wax or wood, were used in healing rites or as protective charms. Unfortunately, during periods of witchcraft panic, these objects could be misinterpreted. If authorities found a poppet in someone's home, it might be taken as evidence of malice or sorcery, even when it was nothing more than a simple household object. The idea that a small human-shaped object could contain influence, good or bad, was already deeply rooted by then. By the 19th century, when mass production made dolls far more common, new fears emerged. Victorian mourning culture, with its interest in death photography and sentimental artifacts, sometimes included mourning dolls, life-size representations of deceased infants placed in prams or kept in family homes. Today these figures unnerve us, but at that time they were objects of comfort. It's in the 20th century, however, that the modern concept of the haunted doll really begins to take shape. The growing interest in spiritualism meant that more people were attending seances, reading about ghostly phenomena, and collecting objects said to hold psychic energy. Stories began to circulate of dolls that cried without reason, changed position when no one was watching, or carried the personality of someone long dead. Some of these tales became famous. Robert the Doll in Key West, for example, belonged to a boy named Robert Eugene Otto, and witnesses claimed the doll moved on its own and glared at people who spoke harshly about it. Today it sits behind glass in a museum, where visitors are warned to ask permission before taking its photo. Annabelle, made famous by films, started as an ordinary Raggedy Ann doll, said to have caused chaos for nurses in the 1970s. And the UK has its own recent accounts as well. One of the most unusual comes from the Highlands, involving a Scottish doll that spent years in New Zealand before being returned home. According to a documented report by researcher Mark Wallbank, the doll had belonged to a Scottish woman whose family later claimed it affected her young grandson. They described dramatic shifts in his mood when the doll was in the house, vivid night terrors about an attacker, and also an incident in which the boy fainted after opening the storage box where the doll was kept. The family, initially skeptical, eventually decided the object needed to be removed. Wallbank brought it back to Scotland during a research trip and entrusted it to Highland Paranormal in Inverness, who remain its custodians. Since its return, they've reported no activity. But the case stands out because it involved multiple witnesses, a clear timeline, and a documented handover between investigators. It's also a reminder that stories like these aren't confined to distant places or old folklore. Sometimes they happen in the present day, with real people trying to understand why an ordinary object seems to carry an atmosphere they can't quite explain. These stories share a pattern. A simple object becomes a focal point for fear, loss, or unexplained behaviour. The doll isn't dangerous because of what it does, but because of what people believe it might be capable of. Psychologists have studied why dolls, more than any other object, inspire this kind of response. One idea is the uncanny valley, the discomfort people feel when something looks almost human, but not quite. A doll's fixed expression, its glass eyes and frozen smile, can feel too close to life for comfort, especially when placed in a dim room or seen out the corner of your eye. Another explanation is more emotional. Dolls often play a role in childhood, a time that carries strong memory and vulnerability. And when a doll becomes associated with distress through a tragic event, a family death or an unsettling incident, it can become the focus of all that emotion. The object becomes symbolic, a container for whatever the person cannot easily process. In paranormal research, dolls attract attention for a different reason. They're small, portable, and personal. They're passed from hand to hand. They sit close to beds. They're present during childhood illnesses and family arguments. And to believers, this makes them potential recording devices for strong emotional energy. An idea not that far removed from the stone tape theory. In recent years, haunted doll stories have seen a resurgence. Social media is full of posts about dolls bought on auction sites, with claims of attachments, strange behaviours, or uneasy atmospheres. Paranormal investigators often treat dolls as focal points during experiments. They use EMF detectors, voice recorders, or thermal cameras to see whether the object responds. And then there are those dolls whose stories carry enough weight, enough detail, enough witness accounts, and enough emotional intensity that they become known far beyond the people who own them. Peggy is one of the rare cases that stands apart. Her story didn't grow from rumour or faded family memory. It emerged in the present day, in real time, among people actively trying to understand why so many reactions to her were so intense. From the moment she appeared, witnesses described symptoms that were difficult to ignore: sudden headaches, nausea, chills, or an anxious presence that made some viewers switch off videos of her entirely. These weren't vague impressions, but consistent physical responses reported by people who'd never met each other. One of the investigators who became closely involved in Peggy's case, and whose work features in Fiona's cursed collection of haunted dolls, helped document everything that unfolded around her. It's worth keeping that in mind as we move forward. Haunted dolls may have a long and complicated past, but Peggy belongs to a very modern kind of encounter, one shaped by technology, witness testimony, and reactions that people struggle to explain. Just a quick note before we continue. If I sound a little different in this section, I'm fighting off a chest infection. Peggy's story began in the most ordinary way imaginable, with a simple request for help. There were no legends attached to her, no history passed down through a family. What happened next came from the people who handled her, witnesses who reacted to her, and the investigator who tried to make sense of it all. Peggy first came to wider attention in 2015, when reports emerged of people feeling unwell after seeing her, not touching her, not holding her, but simply looking at her. At the centre of the story was paranormal investigator Jayne Harris, a researcher known for taking a measured, grounded approach to unusual claims. Jayne wasn't new to the world of haunted objects. She'd been studying alleged paranormal activity since she was 15, first drawn to it through family visits to spiritualist churches and talks by mediums. Back then, she says, the idea of survival after death was something she simply accepted. But as she grew older, her view changed. She began reading psychological theories and learning how to evaluate reports more critically. By 18, she says she was taking a more diagnostic scientific approach to claims of paranormal activity. It wasn't enough anymore to hear a story. She wanted to understand why it happened and whether it could be verified. And even with that background, Peggy challenged her. The doll wasn't found in an antique shop or an attic. She came from a garden shed in Sheffield, left there by a woman who owned her only briefly. She had taken the doll into her home and began noticing small things at first. Lights flicking when she walked past, a faint tapping she couldn't trace, the uneasy sense of being watched from the corner of the room. She didn't try to sell her on or pass her on. She just wanted the doll out the house. And that's where Jayne came in. When Jayne collected the doll, she didn't know what to expect. Most cases involving haunted objects turn out to be psychological. Items tied to deceased relatives, objects that carry emotional weight. Jayne explained later. A lot of the time, it's simply a psychological thing, triggered by the introduction of something which once belonged to that person. People project memories and emotions onto objects, and these emotions shape their experiences. But Peggy was different. She wasn't connected to a relative or a family tragedy. Her background was largely unknown. That meant the usual explanations didn't fit as neatly. Once Jayne brought Peggy into her care, things quickly became complicated. People who interacted with the doll, even remotely, through photos or short videos, began to report unusual symptoms. Some felt a sudden rush of anxiety or become unexpectedly tearful. Others described sharp headaches, chest tightness, or a feeling as though something was pressing down on them. A small number reported a sense of breathlessness or a heaviness that came on the moment they saw her. And in the most extreme cases, there were reports of heart attacks and strokes that witnesses believed were linked to their encounter with Peggy. Jayne was careful not to sensationalize any of this. She didn't claim Peggy was cursed or possessed or dangerous. What she did say was straightforward. Peggy the Doll was probably my most puzzling case, and that was coming from someone who'd seen many. The story soon reached the attention of Zach Bagans, and in December 2016, Jayne was invited to appear on his television series Deadly Possessions. She and her husband Simon were flown to Las Vegas, though Peggy travelled separately. They spent 4 days filming inside Zach's newly opened haunted museum, and the session ended with a séance led by psychic Patti Negri, an experience Jayne described as most unusual, with moments she hadn't expected. Over time, the reports from visitors grew so frequent that the museum began asking guests to sign waivers before entering the room where Peggy was displayed. People reported feeling unwell, short of breath, or emotionally overwhelmed. Zach himself, according to Jayne, became concerned about safety, even wondering whether Peggy would force the museum to close a room entirely. Despite how dramatic that sounds, Jayne's perspective remained cautious. She emphasized that unusual reactions do not prove a haunting. People can become frightened, overwhelmed, or anxious for many reasons. Objects can act as catalysts, triggering thoughts or feelings the person already carries. In some cases, she explained, people inherit items from loved ones who've passed, and the simple presence of that object can stir powerful emotions. But again, Peggy wasn't inherited. She wasn't personal. She came from a stranger's shed. And that's what made things more complicated. Without emotional ties, how do you explain the sudden reactions? Jayne's approach was to treat a potentially haunted object the same way she would a potentially haunted building. Observe, record, look for patterns. She recommended keeping logs of events, durations and triggers, noting anything that seemed out of place. It can be a long process, she said, and requires patience. Jayne also spoke about the limits of science. She believes science can describe the effects of emotion, raised heart rate, dilated pupils, changes in breathing, but not the origin of emotion itself. The same, she suggests, is true of consciousness. Brain scans can show which areas activate, but they can't pinpoint where the thoughts come from. It may well be that our brain is a receiver, she said, a device picking up something rather than generating it. Whether that something relates to Peggy is unanswered, and Jayne never pretends to have the answer. What she offers are observations, patterns, and the experiences of people who came into contact with the doll, and there were many. What makes Peggy's case compelling to me is that there isn't one dramatic incident, but more a build-up of small, consistent reports. Visitors who felt overwhelmed without knowing her history. Staff who grew wary in her presence. Strangers who experienced symptoms after seeing her online. I don't think these experiences prove anything by themselves, but there's no doubt they form a pattern. And in paranormal research, consistent patterns are worth paying attention to. Peggy now sits in one of the museum's most talked about rooms, behind glass and monitored carefully. And Jayne remains thoughtful about the case, looking back not with fear but with curiosity. Her work with Peggy didn't give her a final answer, but it raised questions. Questions that continue to sit at the edge of paranormal study. Can an object trigger psychological responses simply because it looks unsettling? Can belief alone produce symptoms, or is there something about certain items, their history, their previous owners, their environment that leaves a trace we don't yet understand. Jayne's final thoughts on the matter reflect that ongoing uncertainty. Science, she says, is powerful but limited. It can explain patterns, but not the meaning behind them. Science has its limits. What it's up to us to work out is how we can best use these limitations to further our knowledge and understanding. Peggy remains one of the most well-known haunted dolls in the world, not because she's dramatic, but because she straddles the line between psychology and the unexplained. Because so many people have experienced something around her, and because none of these experiences have an easy label. Peggy isn't an ancient relic dug from the earth or a legend shaped across centuries. She didn't come from a battlefield or a cursed house, or the ruins of a forgotten village. She appeared in the modern world, a plastic doll taken from a shed in Sheffield, and yet her story unsettled people across the globe. And maybe that's why she's so difficult to dismiss. Most so-called haunted objects arrive with a built-in explanation, a tragedy, a name, a history that gives people something to cling to. Peggy had none of that. No folklore, no warnings, no narrative shaped by time. Everything we know about her comes from those who handled her, those who reacted to her, and those who tried to understand why. A simple object, no mythology, just a doll that made people feel something they couldn't quite explain. In a way that makes her stranger than the old ghost stories. A medieval revenant or a centuries-old curse sits comfortably within folklore, distant, dramatic, safely separated from life. Peggy doesn't. She sits firmly in the present day, in a world of camera phones, online reactions, and people keenly aware of how easily stories can spiral. And still, the reactions came. Some mild, headaches, tightness in the chest, sudden anxiety, some stronger. Enough for people to step back from the screen. Enough for a museum to introduce waivers. Enough for experienced investigators to pause and reassess. What makes this case compelling is how carefully it was handled. Jayne Harris didn't sensationalize anything. She measured, she recorded, and analysed in the same way she would a supposedly haunted building. That's what makes the story stand out. Not drama, discipline. And that's where the real message lies. Peggy challenges the assumption that everything can be neatly explained. Science can track a heart rate, but not the origin of dread. It can map brain activity, but not the thought that caused the spike. It can describe the effects of fear, but not why the fear appeared in the first place. Peggy also reminds us that the paranormal isn't confined to atmospheric settings. It doesn't wait in ruined castles or old roads. Sometimes it's in the most ordinary, run-of-the-mill places. A suburban shed, a museum room, a photo, or video online. Strangeness doesn't rely on location, it relies on experience. If there's something to take from Peggy's case, maybe it's this. Mystery hasn't disappeared. Even the simplest objects can challenge what we think we understand. And some of the most memorable stories aren't the ones shaped by centuries, they're the ones unfolding now. And with Christmas coming, when toys and dolls make their way into homes across the country, it's worth remembering one small thing. Most dolls are nothing more than gifts and keepsakes. But every now and then, an ordinary object turns out to be something else entirely. So enjoy the season. Just maybe keep an eye on the new arrivals. And if Peggy's story has caught your interest, Fiona's book, A Cursed Collection of Haunted Dolls, is well worth exploring. A thoughtful, eerie, and brilliantly researched book available now from all major booksellers.